In 2018, I finally achieved what I had long dreamed of: admission to the Merchant Navy Academy in Pune. The ocean had always called to me, a vast, open wilderness that promised adventure and a life far from the mundane. My grandfather had been a Navy man himself, and I grew up listening to his stories, spending hours leafing through his old books, captivated by the tales of far-off places and perilous waters. So when I received my acceptance letter, I felt like I was stepping into my own legend. Little did I know that I would face a different kind of peril, one that I could never have imagined. The day I arrived at the academy, my family was beside me, full of pride and excitement. They helped me carry my bags, set up my room, and made sure everything was in place. My mother kissed me on the forehead, her eyes misty, and my father clapped my back, telling me to make them proud. The room itself was plain, with faded beige walls, a small window that offered a view of a dense line of trees, and 3 beds. My bed was closest to the window, which I thought was lucky until night fell. Once my family left, I introduced myself to my 2 roommates, Rakesh and Vijay. They had arrived earlier that week and already seemed comfortable, though I noticed something odd. They seemed uneasy, casting glances at each other as they helped me set up my things. When I asked if everything was all right, they quickly brushed it off, though I caught Rakesh muttering something under his breath about the room. I figured it was just nervous energy. After all, we were all starting a new chapter in our lives, right? The first night in that room was strange. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rustle of the leaves outside. The wind seemed to carry a whisper, a faint murmur that barely registered at first, but grew louder as the night deepened. I tossed and turned, trying to ignore it, but the sound wormed its way into my mind. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful sleep, though the feeling of being watched lingered, even in my dreams. The following day, I overheard some cadets in the hallway whispering about our room. One of them glanced at me with an almost pitying expression and quickly turned away. When I asked Rakesh and Vijay what they knew about it, they exchanged a look before Rakesh shrugged, saying, "Just campus gossip. Every place has its ghost stories." But there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of fear in his eyes, that made me wonder if he was hiding something. I let it go, too tired from our first day of classes to push any further. The real nightmare began on the 3rd night. As I lay in bed, I noticed that the air felt colder, almost damp, as though a chill had seeped through the walls. I pulled my blanket tighter around me, listening to the rhythmic breathing of Rakesh and Vijay, who had both fallen asleep quickly. I envied them, but a strange sense of unease kept me awake. As I stared at the window, watching the tree branches sway in the wind, I heard it again, the faint, scratching sound. This time, it was closer, almost as if it were coming from within the walls. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, just the creaking of an old building. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the scratching resumed, louder this time, insistent. It seemed to be moving, traveling along the wall, inching closer to my bed. My heart raced as I sat up again, this time throwing the blanket off and swinging my legs over the side of the bed. I was going to wake Rakesh and Vijay, but then I froze, my eyes widening as I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Rakesh and Vijay were both lying stiffly on their beds, their eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Their faces were pale, almost ashen, and their mouths hung open in silent terror. I whispered their names, my voice barely audible, but they didn't respond. I took a shaky step forward, and that's when I heard it, a deep, guttural voice that seemed to resonate from the very walls around us. "Leave." The word was a whisper, but it struck me like a physical blow. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as the floor seemed to tilt beneath me. I turned, looking wildly around the room, but there was no one there. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though something unseen had taken hold of the very atmosphere, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I backed away, my gaze darting from corner to corner, and that's when I saw it. A dark, indistinct shape, crouched in the corner by the window, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. My legs felt rooted to the spot as the figure slowly rose, its eyes fixed on me, unblinking. It took a step forward, and I felt an overwhelming wave of dread wash over me, paralyzing me. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and skeletal, and pointed at me, its eyes blazing with a terrible, unnatural light. In that moment, the door to our room flew open, and the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I collapsed onto the bed, gasping for breath, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. Rakesh and Vijay stirred, blinking as though waking from a nightmare, their expressions dazed and confused. I wanted to tell them what I had seen, but the words caught in my throat. I knew somehow that whatever was in that room wouldn't tolerate our presence much longer. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. The scratching became a constant presence, and every night I could feel the figure watching us, lurking in the shadows. I began to see it in my dreams, its face twisted in a grotesque mask of rage and sorrow, its eyes filled with an unbearable emptiness. I woke up each morning drenched in sweat, my body aching as though I had been physically assaulted in my sleep. Rakesh and Vijay were no better. They became withdrawn, their faces drawn and pale. We barely spoke, each of us haunted by the knowledge that something was horribly wrong. I tried to bring it up with the campus authorities, but they dismissed me, saying it was just nerves, that I needed to focus on my studies and ignore the silly superstitions. One night, in a desperate attempt to find answers, I stayed up late, poring over old newspaper articles online. It was then that I found it, the story of a cadet who had lived in our room 10 years earlier. According to the article, he had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a hastily scrawled note that read, "It won't let me go." The authorities had dismissed it as a prank, assuming he had run away, but the cadet's family had insisted that he had been tormented by strange occurrences in that room. With this knowledge, I returned to the room, determined to confront the entity. That night, I waited in the darkness, my flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. When the scratching began, I called out, demanding to know what it wanted. For a long moment, there was only silence, and then, slowly, the figure appeared, materializing from the shadows as though drawn by my words. It moved toward me, its eyes blazing, and I could feel its anger, its desperation. "I can't leave," it whispered, its voice filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo through my bones. "Help me." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I felt its cold breath on my face, its fingers brushing against my skin, and I knew then that this spirit was trapped, bound to this place by some terrible, unfinished business. I promised to help, though I had no idea how, and for a brief moment, the figure seemed to fade, its form growing translucent. But that was the last time I saw it. The next night, I woke to a suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. The figure was back, more solid, more terrifying than ever. It leaned over me, its face inches from mine, its eyes filled with a malevolent gleam. "You lied," it hissed, its voice cold and venomous. I tried to scream, to fight, but my body refused to obey. I could feel its fingers tightening around my throat, cutting off my air, and I knew in that moment that I was going to die. The last thing I remember is the sound of the door bursting open, Rakesh and Vijay's voices shouting, and then nothing. I woke up in the hospital, my body weak, my throat bruised. Rakesh and Vijay were there, their faces filled with relief, but I could see the fear lingering in their eyes. They told me I'd been found unconscious on the floor, barely breathing. They had heard me thrashing, screaming, and when they couldn't wake me, they had forced the door open, finding me pale and limp, a shadow hovering over me. After that, I left the academy. I never returned, and I never spoke of what happened in that room. But sometimes, late at night, I can still feel that cold, ghostly touch, hear the faint scratching in the darkness, and I know that whatever was in that room is still there, waiting for its next victim.